Greetings, students. Let's talk about the cell cycle. All right, so far this year we have learned a lot about cells. It makes sense, right? Because our body is made of tons of different kinds of cells. They're super diverse in how they look and the functions that they do. They are diverse in the proteins that make them up. And they do a lot of different things, all of our different cells, right? They are doing transcription and translation. They're doing signal transduction and sensing their surroundings. They're performing metabolic reactions and breaking down glucose in order to make ATP. They are busy little guys. But there's one thing we have not talked about yet that is super important that cells are doing quite often, and that is divide. So it's good to keep in mind that we all started as one single cell. I think this is a pretty crazy fact. So here is a video of a zebrafish. So zebrafish are cool because they are actually see-through when they are embryos, so we can see them developing. And so in this picture, what you can see is up here, this is at the 2-cell stage. So this zebrafish egg has just been fertilized super recently, and there has been 1 cell division, and now there are 2 cells. And now you can see over time, now there's 4, now there's 8, and it's just going to keep going. And we can actually watch under the microscope this little zebrafish go from 1 single cell to a whole little tiny baby fish. Let me speed us up a little bit here. And if we do that, we can go, here we go. So this is the zebrafish developing over 24 hours. Obviously, this is a fish, but same principle for us. We start as 1 single cell, and then over weeks, and then finally 9 months, that cell divides thousands and millions of times until it becomes all of the cells that make up a whole little tiny baby, or in this case, like a whole little tiny fish. And this is all just cells dividing. Isn't that amazing? So cell division is obviously something that's really important for biology, and that is where we are starting this unit. So there are 3 reasons that cells need to divide, and to remember the 3 reasons, you want to use the acronym GR. So G stands for growth. Cells divide in order for an organism to become larger. So in that example, we had 1 little teeny tiny cell that started, 1 fertilized egg, and through cell division, it started to become larger. It was becoming a little tiny baby fish. Same thing, when you were a little tiny baby, you were smaller than you are now, right? You are larger because you are made of more cells, because your cells divided. So that's reason number 1, growth. Next up, R. This first R stands for repair. So another reason cells need to divide is to replace cells that have been damaged by injury. Say you cut a gash in your hand. You have literally damaged those cells. So to heal that gash, you need to have those cells around the wound divide and actually literally fill in that gap. And then the last R stands for reproduction. So both asexual and sexual reproduction requires cell division, and either way, it's necessary in order to make new organisms, in order to make babies. So those are the 3 reasons that cells need to divide. Like I said, you can remember that with the acronym GR, G-R-R. All right, and there are 2 types of cell division, and you might remember this a little bit from middle school. So the first one is mitosis. In mitosis, you start with 1 single cell, and it divides to make 2 identical cells. On the other hand, you have meiosis, and in meiosis, you start with 1 single cell, but it divides to make 4 unique cells. It's going to make sperm and eggs, which we'll learn a little bit more about in the coming weeks. But so 2 types of cell division, mitosis and meiosis, but both of them are 1 cell dividing into multiple cells. Okay, so let's think about what is a cell actually doing. So most of a cell's life is spent in something called interphase. So interphase is everything a cell does that we have learned about so far this year. So that is things like metabolism, cell signaling, transcription, translation, DNA replication, all of that good stuff. That all happens here in this phase called interphase, which is most of the cell's life. And then 1 little teeny tiny part of the cell's life is when that cell divides. That would be mitosis usually. And that's very important, of course, but it is only a small part of the cell's life, and it's good to keep that in mind as we start to talk about the life cycle of the cell, which is called the cell cycle. Okay, so here's a more nuanced picture of the cell cycle. So like I just said, we can think of the cell cycle as interphase and then mitosis. So interphase would be all of the cell's life doing everything a cell does except mitosis, except dividing. Interphase itself can be divided into 3 phases. These are not to scale, just so you know. Okay, so the first phase of interphase is called G1 phase. That stands for gap 1. This is most of the cell's life. This is when the cell is doing most of its cell things, like transcription and translation. It's making new proteins, it's growing, it's detecting signals from the outside, it's doing lots of good cell things. At some point, if the cell decides, you know what, I think I'm going to divide, then it's going to enter the next phase, which is called S phase. The S stands for synthesis, because we are going to synthesize, we are going to make new copies of DNA. This is when DNA replication happens. That's S phase. And then the next phase is G2. This is called gap 2. Now that the cell has copied its DNA, it's going to have to divide. So in gap 2, the cell gets ready to divide. And then finally, we have M phase. The M stands for mitosis. And this is when the cell actually will divide into 2 cells. And then both of those new cells will enter G1. And they'll start the cell cycle all over again. This is what every single cell in your body is doing right now. It's someplace in the cell cycle. You do have some very special cells in your body that are in something called G0. G0 is a specialized form of G1 where cells just stay there forever. Sometimes it's called cell cycle exit because that cell is like, you know what, I'm never going to divide. I'm just going to hang out in G1 for the rest of my life and stay here forever. So for example, the neurons in your nervous system hang out in G0 phase. They never divide. And that's because they've made all these complicated connections with each other, and they don't want to break those connections by dividing. Okay, so the cell cycle is really important, and it's so important that it's really carefully regulated. And that's because if something goes wrong in the cell cycle, it can have really detrimental effects. So rarely, sometimes your cell cycle goes too slow. If your cell cycle is too slow, then there won't be enough cells being produced, and that is actually what causes hair loss, because these cells in your hair follicles just kind of get sleepy and don't work as well. What's more common, and actually a lot more dangerous, is when your cell cycle starts to go too fast and it starts to cycle out of control. This is going to cause too many cells. That's what happens if you've ever gotten a wart. Or even more scary, that is what actually causes tumors. That's what causes cancer, is when the cell cycle starts to grow out of control. Okay, so that is an overview of the cell cycle. And in the next video, we'll start to think about how is the cell cycle regulated.